I am very excited to be here. I heard about ESI SyNC. I now, have my first experience. This looks good, and it's, has a title that excites, or it has the topic that excites me. So, like the linking hypothesis, where neuroscience, computation, and cognition meet. And so, what I'm going to be talking about, the linking hypothesis in one corner of cognition today, and that will be long-term knowledge, basically, or more familiarly, I think people think of this as long-term memory. So let's see what I mean by this. So here's the roadmap. The roadmap will start with the demonstration, a discussion of the current view of what neurobiology of memory is. And after doing this, I think I'll try to convince you that it doesn't do justice to what it really is, like what memory or knowledge, long-term knowledge is. Then the next step will be to discuss the framework called language of thought, which does give justice to what memory or long-term representations are. And it views them as from the angle of a productive and computational system. And then the third step would be to take this, let's call it new view, even though it's not a new view at all, and then build the linking hypothesis around it. So can we take that cognitive framework and now rebuild the neurobiology around it? Okay, so that's the approximate plan. And basically what I'll be doing, I have a partner in crime in first class, so all crimes are his. So I'm going to be basically following the recent paper that David and I had in TICS. It's available online, if you need any more information, that's the source. Okay, so let's start with the first point. So what is the current state of the art in terms of neurobiological basis for memory? And I mean, I don't have to say anything, I wouldn't have to say much about this to this audience anyway, but, parts of this were mentioned in the first talk by Juliana. So the current state of the art is the synaptic plasticity hypothesis, right? So this is one of the quotes that summarizes it very nicely. Activity-dependent synaptic plasticity is induced at appropriate synapses during memory formation and is both necessary and sufficient for the encoding and storage of memory. So it's a very strong hypothesis that tells you, makes a necessary and sufficient condition for memory, for both memory encoding and storage. Okay. And basically you can, unpack it into two simple questions that I'm going to be using in my presentation. So the first question is basically repeating what I've just said. How are memories encoded and stored? Well, they are stored in terms of synapses, by changing the strength of synapses. The interesting question for me will be the second question: what exactly is memory? Like, so what are we storing? And so in that current view on the synaptic view of memory, what we're storing is basically associations. Okay, these are associations between events or between concepts, but it's pairwise associations. And this is where I'll have, that's the first issue we'll be taking. So let's look at this concept of association and see what exactly, where it comes from. And it comes from a good linking hypothesis. It comes, like this neurobiological idea of associative view, synaptic view of memory, does have a very strong linking to psychology and specifically empirical psychologists. Okay, so an empirical psychologist, like Locke is a great example of that. A concept has is a collection of sensory experiences, and those sensory experiences are taken together, connected, linked together into that concept by means of associative bonds. So neurobiology did its job, right? It really linked those three ideas into and provided a neurobiological mapping to it. The concept is now a cell assembly. What those sensory experiences are individual neurons, and they are connected via Hebbian synapses. That's the current view. And so the concept here is milk, so let's make this view more complex. Let's add a couple of more concepts around milk. Well, we could add a concept like a baby, because babies and milk obviously are associated, and so are cows and milk. But if you look and I mean, that's basically, you know, what you'll read in the psychology textbook or a neuroscience textbook. That's our long-term memory organization, right? We have a conceptual network that's connected in, like through associations, but that must, like, I mean, can't be enough, because the next thing you can you realize is that babies drink milk, whereas cows produce milk. But the association, the nature of associations, or like, you know, synapses that are, you know, on each side of the milk are exactly the same, whereas the relations that those associations need to encode are completely different. So basically, I mean, it's a very simple thing, right? Associative bonds only encode a single type of relation, whereas in reality, what you see in this example is that you need to go beyond a simple association into something more complex that allows you to relate concepts in a much more refined way. Okay. So this is basically what's summarized in this slide. So there is an insufficiency in the notion of association, which comes from its limitedness and being limited to a single thing. And also, you know, like, you know, I can consider it, like, continue the list, but one of the cute things which was my starting point, is actually realizing that on this associative view, for example, you can't even think of how to encode negative facts. Negative facts are informative. So knowing that penguin is not a mammal is informative. It's not like having no information about penguins and mammals, or like knowing that Mary doesn't wear leather is again an informative thing. But if it's an associative relationship, how do you associate things that never occur together in the first place, right? That's not even a starter, right? So that's one of the, you know, other. So as I said, I can continue the list, but from a cognitive perspective, to describe the richness of long-term knowledge or memory, associations seem not to be sufficient. Okay. And, you know, if I'm not convincing, you know, there is one person in the field who's extremely convincing. You know, those who know you recognize from the picture, like, it's Randy Gallistel. He spoke about this for years and years and years. He wrote about this also for years. You know, very punchy papers, 2017, 2021. He has a book in 2010 that mentions all this, you know. But he's a rare person in the field who has been kind of banging on the issue for like the last maybe 50 years, right? So the field overall has kind of distanced itself from considerations like this. Okay, so I've talked about what is stored, not being kind of ideally described by associations. Just as a very quick sideline, I'll also say that even the first point, you know, like associations being realized through synapses has also been questioned. It has been questioned by Gallistel. It has been questioned more recently by, you know, other people too, like including Sam Gershman, who has, you know, written it up in one very long paper. So I'm just going to go through like very few of his arguments and very quickly. So don't ask me, because I won't give you many more details. But basically, if you think that synapses is the place where memories are stored, then you also have other, like, you know, then even like that part of the story is also like cannot be complete, it seems. Because, for example, synaptic plasticity, you know, has a very clear time scale, right? It's a time scale of tenths of milliseconds. That's the time scale of spike timing dependency, like the spike, plasticity is formed, right? So, but then we have all kind of associations that you can see in Pavlovian conditioning, for example, and other cases which form where the temporal relationships are at the order of hours and minutes, minutes and hours, and, you know, maybe sometimes, yeah, that's enough. So basically, how do you like make this up? You know, so maybe you can go from milliseconds to seconds, but as Gershman would argue, like all kind of explanations, or like very few explanations, but even those explanations that have been given on how you can preserve that increase that time scale to minutes, like they actually are quite problematic. Or, for example, you know, how do you explain the fact that memory persists when you've kind of messed up with the synapses? So you can take a planarian, that's a flatworm, teach it to avoid light by associating with shock, right? Then cut off the head, and then, you know, the head regenerates, takes about a week. The new head knows to avoid the light. Right. So how does that, I mean, if the head and the brain of that worm, you know, is the seat for the synapses that have been pre-trained, you know, how come you can see the same behavior after the whole head has been removed, right? Or even in a more kind of, wacky case, let's call it memory transfer phenomenon, where you take a worm, cut it up, like go through, like put it through the grinder and then like feed to the next worm. The next worm actually acquires the knowledge that the first worm had. All this stuff like has been done like, I guess, 50 years ago and has been questioned, but now apparently the memory transfer experiments have come back and, like are done in a much more kind of convincing way or experimentally solid way, and, and still show the same results. So like, if that's true, according to Gershman, we should stop and think, like, is synaptic plasticity the whole story for memory? Okay. But this was, on a side for me. So like the main thing, I'll come back to what a stored question, because this is where, like I feel way more comfortable, and that's where the story will develop. So coming back to, but before I kind of come back to this, like it seems that the situation, it reminds me like the Marxist definition of where, like of what constitutes conditions for a revolutionary situation. So there are two things, like Lenin formulated them, so they're part of like my upbringing. I am young enough, but I'm still old enough for that too. So apparently the two conditions for a revolution are the bottoms don't want to, and the tops cannot live in the old way. Okay. And it feels exactly like that. It feels like the data in this memory field doesn't want to fit. And the theories, basically cannot embrace the data anymore. In order to turn this into a revolution, you need a third thing, like took Lenin some more time to figure it out. Like that's not enough. You also need working masses readiness for revolutionary action. And I guess, that must be us, or like, ESI SyNC or someone, but it feels like the field may be in that, maybe we're reaching that kind of peak. Okay, so this was the first point, basically. So I've demonstrated the current neurobiological view, and I explained where, from the cognitive perspective, where that view is insufficient, right? So let's see what can be, what do we want instead? If associations are not enough, what is a better alternative for them? So, and the better alternative for them comes, one of the good alternatives for them comes from this framework that's known as the language of thought hypothesis, that was advanced by a famous philosopher, Jerry Fodor. So the book with the same name, so was published in 1975 and kind of changed the world of, psychology, philosophy, linguistics, and maybe, one day will change the world of neuroscience too. Not yet, though. And I'll show why not. Because basically the way the language of thought hypothesis views the knowledge, and by thought here, like you can just basically, I'm using it synonymously with knowledge, is that the mental representations underlying thoughts, they are systematic, right? So first of all, thought is a system, and that system is productive, it is compositional, and it has symbolic primitives. Okay, so I've said lots of words. Let's see what it means, In order to illustrate what it means, well, actually, no, let me show what it means. So basically, the main thing about the main mechanism by which the productivity and compositional in that is achieved in that system is via the notion of a predicate. So a predicate is like a function that takes an argument and yields an output, right? So except the predicates are so important in that system that, like they go beyond what you traditionally think of a function. So you can think of, for example, maybe kissing being a function of two entities, John and Mary. But actually, like in this framework, basically everything you can think of apart from individual entities will be a function. So in this example on top, you can see two entities, that's John and Mary. Those are individuals in the world that can serve as arguments to functions. And functions can be, the easy functions are here, like, running is a function or pinching is a function, okay? So the systematicity of this thing, so first of all, the predicate nature of this thing will be that everything that is in function can take an argument or two, depending on how many places it has, to produce a meaning, okay? So if you take run and combine it with Mary, it'll be, you are basically describing an event where Mary is running, okay? Or where if you take pinch and combine it with Mary and John, you have an event where Mary pinched John, okay? But so that's one part. So that's about the importance of predicates. The other part is about productivity and systematicity. And it shows up in many ways, but one easy way to illustrate the idea is to say that if you have access to those four concepts, two entities and two functions, then you should be able to consider all of those sentences and not just one or not just two and not just three, okay? So it means that you have this compositional kind of grammar that allows that, where you plug your individual concepts and you are able to then consider all possible outcomes or like exhaustive, number of things that the combination of the grammar and the lexicon can provide you with, okay? So, okay, if there is a very this hypothesis was was first formulated in 1975. It was kind of there on the landscape. It now is brought back, and then it was basically forgotten, for a lot of psychology and neuroscience at least. But it has been brought back into spotlight by this recent paper by Kultedan. Poirot, sorry, an I is, I'm too much into Poirot. Okay, and Mandelbaum in PBS. So it's very recent and very recommended paper. Okay, but so just to give you a bit more of an essence of that framework. So what I want to do is to show how that the language of thought idea can be systematized in terms of like a logic. Okay, so what is the formalism that can describe that idea of language of thought? And the language of thought, I mean, an ideal formalism will basically be so rich as to be able to explain all kinds of thoughts that you can consider. And I'm not going to provide you, I'm only going to provide you with a small toy example that describes a lot of thoughts, but not all of them. And it's the example of the logical system that's known as predicate calculus. It also is known as first order logic or first order calculus, and it only can describe, as I've said, a subset of the kind of thoughts that we can consider, but that's an important subset. Let's just start with it, okay? So within that formalism, you basically have several types of, you have a lexicon, okay? And within that lexicon, you have several types of kind of entities. So you have entities like individual constants, like these are individuals. So like Joe, Mary, Aristotle, Fodor, and so on will be like, individuals. You have a notion of variable. You have a notion of a predicate, which is very important. So I'll come back to this. And then you also have two other entries in on the lexicon side, which are logical connectives. So things like and or, not, or entailment relationship that allow you to relate predicates and combine them into bigger meanings. I'll show an example in a second. And then two quantifiers are allowed. So there is an existential quantifier and a universal quantifier, any or all. Okay, so very, very simple system. And yet that system allows us to do quite a lot. So you can, so for example, you can express a meaning like Mary is human using the predicate human and applying it to the individual Mary, right? That's the same as I've done in the previous example. You can have a two-place predicate like Chase, and to get a sentence like, for example, Fido, that's Chase is Mary, Fido the dog, right? Then you can, use your logical connectives to bring those bits into bigger, more complex expressions, right? So Mary is human and Mary runs, for example. You can get it by combining one predicate and another one through conjunction, right? Or you can have this is an example of like a more complex expression. So every cat chased Fido, right? So you can read this. I mean, that meaning is conveyable using a combination of a quantifier, and then some predicates. So let's try and unpack what's here. So every cat chases Fido is encoded as for any X such that X is a cat, it is true that X chases Fido. Right? So very kind of, very rudimentary and yet quite powerful system because it allows you to do these things and, many other things in like in language, but also more importantly, thought, because we're talking about thought here. Okay. So, because predicate is such an important notion, I'm going to spend a few more words, a few more slides talking about the notion of a predicate, okay? And you'll see later why it's important. So what predicates basically do in this system, they look at the amount of entities out there, the world, like the domain of entities, and each predicate subsets that domain to a subset that are relevant, like, that makes that predicate true. So let's say we have a mini world of entities like this, so 9 objects, right? Nine concepts there, and you are looking at a predicate like human. So what human does is takes like 3, it's subset that set of 9 to a set of 3, basically, of the 3 entities that are for which the predicate human is true, right? So predicate like a single argument predicate, so one place predicate, is basically just a subsetting function, okay? Importantly, actually, I can illustrate it here already, predicates are abstract. So what do we mean by this? Well, so for a predicate like human, that's the output that makes the predicate true. And if you look at those 3 things, you know, they're not necessarily very much alike each other. So there is similarity, of course. In this case, you know, each has a head, and like the head has a brain, you know, if you can kind of introspect enough or whatever, but it's not the case that they're all identical, right? So the predicates have a high degree of abstraction in that the meaning of that predicate is not readable, or like you can't read it off by looking at the entities, right? It's like the sensory features or the sensory kind of the surface input is not enough to decide on the meaning of the predicate. Okay, and so like that next slide kind of illustrates this again with a different predicate. So container. So there are, like, you can think of a container, and you know, depending on the, like your like if I had a kind of a poll here, right? The first thought that came to people's heads would be very different. For some of you, it could have been something like, you know, a I don't know, like a container like this, that like a folder holder, right? For others, it will be like this Tupperware that you use to bring lunch in. For others, you know, it will be maybe like a blood transfusion container, right? So like some kind of a bag, or it doesn't even have to be a blood transfusion. It's just like any bag, right? So the notion of container kind of takes under its umbrella very distinct objects that are made of different materials, right? Plastic, glass, paper, whatever, what else? Wood. They can be of completely different sizes. They can be tiny, like if you have a jewelry box, and they can be huge if it's a container for storing, for moving furniture, right? They can be, you know, very different shapes, like round and long and so on and so forth. So like, you know, I'm making that point long for like, to give you time to appreciate it. It's a very basic point, yes, yet very important point, right? So there is this fine line. On the one hand, this, like, you know, the notions that we use for our thinking are very abstract because they unite under, you know, the same predicate, like very distinct object, like the very different objects. On the other hand, there is a core container that is true to all of them, right? So it's something that can contain stuff, you know, that can hold stuff. So for example, air cannot be a container for anything, right? So so there is limits to the abstractness, but the abstractness is pretty impressive. Okay, just to kind of add, I mean, so that's one very important part of like what predicates are in thought. The other very important point is what's known as role filler independence. And that's very easy to illustrate now that we've talked about predicates being like, you know, a function that takes an argument. The moment you talk about them as functions taking argument, you've kind of separated the overall meaning of Mary runs into the running part, that can be applied to, like, you know, all kind of individuals, right? Like Mary, John, Rabbit. You can even invent an individual, and without knowing what exactly they will look like or what their properties will be, you will know when that individual qualifies as, you know, Glebe running is running and when it doesn't. Okay, and so that's achieved because you have the separation between the predicate and the argument, or using a slightly different jargon, the role run and the filler John. So in this example here, you have a, you know, a relay. So in this case, John is running first, and they, like, you know, he gives the baton to Mary, and then Mary starts running. So you can think of a predicate run being first bound by the argument John, right, by the filler John. Then there is this kind of, you know, like, I mean, the run is not like is unbound from John because John stops running and it's like now bound to Mary. Okay. This picture may produce an impression that at each single point, the predicate can only be bound to one argument, but that's a wrong impression. It's just that we didn't want to multiply people here, right? On a parallel track, there might be other people running. So at the same time with John, there might be Bill and, someone else, right? So it's just about the fact that there is a temporal boundedness to the predicate that you can bind it to the argument and unbind it from that. And a very similar related point is that, so basically that thing gives you the core of a predicate. So there is a meaning of running that is true independent of who takes of the argument. And that's similar, like the related point to this is that because of those core meanings, I know. I was supposed to happen once when I was here, but it didn't, so it's like, oh, in the middle of the talk, yeah. It should have chosen, like if it came at the time when I was like denouncing someone, it would have been quite nice. Mm-hmm. But a strong association is formed, right? Between, language of thought and, an unnasty sound or whatever. You cannot stop it. So why is beeping continuing? Because can you turn it off or no? No? If you're in your, now it's in your brain, it's worse. Yeah, exactly. Till the next warning signal, like warning day. Okay. Yeah. My bug? Oh, really? I thought I was prone to this. Oh, you're right. Yes. Okay. Seriously. Okay. Indeed, yes. So going back to where we were, I mean, your minds are now clear. I can tell you whatever, the opposite you won't remember, but yes, I will not. So basically, the related thing is that predicates, because they have their core meaning, that meaning is true regardless of the arguments, right? So for example, you can talk about the predicate big, medium, and small, and the relation, the relative relation between those pairs of predicates will be true regardless of what they're applied to, whether those are watches or trees or suitcases that are all of different size and properties. But it still will be the case that the small suitcase will be closer to the medium one than to the large one than anything else. Okay, so you're probably sitting there thinking she's talking about obvious things, and they are obvious things. And so it is even more amazing that those obvious things have been kind of denied and pushed away from the neuroscientific agenda. And they have been. So I actually have the citation here. So from the three fathers of the AI revolution. So the success of DNNs, and DNNs, they don't have, I mean, they're not biological networks, but we all know that they are very much taken to be biologically plausible and inspired, right? So the success of DNNs raises serious doubts about whether understanding a sentence, and for us now today, it's whether thought requires anything like the internal symbolic experiences that are manipulated by using inference rules, right? So exactly what I've just described as the basic thing is clearly denied here. Okay, so we're at point 2 then now, where we have discussed, what we would like, what the semanticists or philosophers or, psychologists, some psychologists at least, would want to have as the core representation for thought, right? They would want to have it predicate-based, they want to have it compositional, they want to have it systematic. So if that's the new proposal, then the next responsible step, of course, would be to find linking hypotheses, to find new linking hypotheses that would take that proposal and link it to the neurobiology. Can we do that? Okay, so the answer is yes, we can, I think, or we think, and the inspiration for this comes from the neurobiology of spatial navigation. So the reason for spatial navigation as a model case here is because it's a very well studied system of knowledge. It's well studied because, since the seminal O'Keefe and Dostrovsky discovery, there was like 50 years of or more of, very nitty-gritty research, and then there is like actually in addition to all the neurobiological research, it turns out, that there is lots of cognitive and specifically kind of symbolic explanations that are made on the way that are maybe not always noticed, but are very clearly noticed when you read things like, for example, that the hippocampus is a cognitive map, right? A map is a notion that requires, having the prior knowledge, being able to kind of manipulate distances and so on, and locate things, on a coordinate space. So that's beyond the purely sensory input, right? So this is just basically to say that even within spatial navigation, there is already a lot of symbolic discussion going on. So can we take that symbolic discussion and kind of upscale it to the level that's needed to represent the thought, okay, or long-term memory? So we can. How can we do it? So here is the starting point. So the neurobiology of spatial navigation, of course, manifests in this like zoo of cells that you all know about, right? So that have been discovered over the years, starting with place cells, and then like boundary cells, direction cells, grid cells, goal cells, object cells, all kind of things. So what I'm going to do in the remaining whatever amount of time is I'm going to give you an example of, starting with the boundary cell. And basically, I'll argue that this is an equivalent of what I've just described the predicates to be. Okay. So let's start with this boundary cell, also known as border cell. For us, the distinction is unimportant. What do they do? So those cells are cells that fire at the boundaries, right? So like if you have a square enclosure here, they fire at the perimeter at the time when the animal is closest to the boundaries. You can do it in the circular enclosure, and that cell would fire at the perimeter as well. It's actually different cells here, different experiments, different authors. Many of those boundary cells or border cells have a preferential directionality, right? So in this case, this cell only fires at the south boundary of the enclosure. But what's important and what's seen already in these examples here is that well, maybe I need to add a bit. So to say that, in this enclosure here, for example, you could change the walls, right? So you can change them from brown color to red color, and the cells will continue firing. You can turn off the light, and the cells will continue firing. You can, change the shape, and the cells will fire, like the boundary cells will fire again. So that already tells you at the fact that whatever stimulates that cell is quite an abstract notion, because it's not about just, brown and high or like a hard, or, it's not about the texture. It's not about the visual stimulus, right? It's about the notion. I mean, it's about something more abstract than that boundary, right? And I'll argue for this even more strongly by showing you a few more results. So like in this case here, so this is an original square enclosure and a border cell that fires at the east boundary. So it fires again at the east boundary if you bring the red, so that's day 1. Let's say this is day 2. So the border cells are very, stable. If you now start doing like magic tricks and kind of expand the enclosure such that you expand the perimeter of that boundary by making it rectangular, the border cell will not at all be kind of puzzled by it. It'll just continue firing across the new larger boundary, right? So that's quite impressive, because that border cell on the first occasion responds to a new part of the boundary, right? That's very abstract reaction. So, or even, I mean, another very cute demonstration. So like here's the original enclosure, like square, and this border cell fires at the west boundary. Now they've added another wall into the enclosure shown by white, right? So this wall that kind of half blocks the room in the middle. And you can see that the same border cell now has developed a new receptive field at the new wall, right? So like a new two west fields now. Again, very impressive because that's a new wall. That's not a familiar experience. And just, at the first encounter, there is the new receptive field, right? So that means that there is that basically, translating into the language of thought kind of jargon, that cell has the notion boundary, and it's which can be applied, right? That can be applied to any argument, right? So anything that can constitute boundary will get like that cell to fire. Here is another representation showing that it doesn't always have to be a protruding boundary. It can be, it can be, for example, the dropped level, right? So this is also a boundary of sorts. If boundary means impediment to movement for you, right? And so like when you've removed the walls of the enclosure such that you have just open surface, you can see that the boundary cell responds to the edge of that open surface now. So that's a very abstract notion because, it's not about like protruding stuff. It's about what impedes movement. Right. So basically, you can see where I'm going, like I've done my job, right? So like I've basically argued that those border cells, they are equivalents to the human predicate, like or language of thought predicate boundary. And they are just as abstract as a human predicate boundary would be. A human predicate boundary would be, like you can talk of boundaries as being, walls. You can talk of boundaries in terms of like, that's meant to be a river that between mountain range, what am I saying? These are like the Pyrenees, right? Then you have the Rio Grande between the Mexican states. That's the boundary as well. You can talk about the boundary of the stage being the drop level, right? So I mean, I'm kind of repeating myself just to drive it home, but it's pretty impressive that the wealth of information that goes under that heading can also be demonstrated to go under the same kind of, to be within the scope of the same cell type, border cell in an animal like rat. And just to make it like, this is my favorite demonstration. So in this experiment here, what was done was that, like the rat in this square arena, like, so the boundary cells were responding to the north wall. Then the wall, like a new wall was inserted. So effectively the size of the enclosure was reduced, right? And so that boundary cell now responds to the, to the moved wall basically, or new wall. But then when the new wall is suspended, that boundary cell doesn't care about the suspended wall anymore. It only cares about the real wall again. So this is impressive, right? Because I mean, there is all this neuroscientific, like neurobiological data that shows that the border cells really care about the notion of impediment, not just about large objects, not just about, like not even about edges, that are in the way, right? It's about like impediments. Okay. So if that wasn't enough, I'll show you like one more example of an object cell. That will be a quicker example, but basically to illustrate the same point and to show that another type of like, it's not just one type of predicate that exists in the rat's brain, boundary. There are many more of those. So here's another type. That's the object. These are object cells. So what do they do? Well, those cells fire in the vicinity of an object. So you have a circular enclosure here, which has an object that's represented by that rectangle. So that cell will fire in the vicinity of the object. If you add another object, so that's this like added circle here, that cell will fire in the vicinity of the new object as well. Here's basically the same data. Sometimes those objects fire just at the object. There are object vector cells that fire, at a certain distance and direction from the object, but the idea is the same. The reason why I'm bringing up this study is because in this study, they actually showed which objects they were manipulating or like, placing into the arena. And you can see it's a very distinct set of objects, right? They were different in size, they were different in texture, in color, and so on. So really that cell that responds to objects does not care about a certain type of object. All it cares about is like a very abstract notion object, right? In this case, even more interestingly, when it comes to objects, so remember how the boundary cells cared about suspension? Well, in case of objects, you shouldn't care about suspension because it's not about impediment to movement. It's about what like some presence in the enclosure, right? And sure enough, this is exactly what happens. So here is like the object cell, object vector cell responding to the object. And when that object is suspended, the object vector cell continues to fire, right? So that tells you that there is basically a second predicate now that we have discovered in the rats, hippocampus, right? Hippocampal system. So that's the object cell. That is a different population of cells. That's argued by Hoydal very, very specifically. And that different population of cells cares about a class of or a category of objects with different properties. And so you can start building a table like this, right? So border cells correspond to the LOT predicate boundary. Object cells correspond to like the predicate object. There are other types of cells that have been discovered, so we can increase our lexicon. Of course, it won't be of the length of the human lexicon of thought, but that's the proof of principle, right? Okay. So this is good, but so we've found the predicates, right? That's good. Can we find one more thing that is very important? This is the logical connectives that put those predicates together. And basically that's where the computational bit starts, right? So that's where you compute bigger meanings. So, well, if you're looking for connection, for logical connectives, of course, you start with AND. That's the easiest one. And of course, you maybe have heard about the notion of conjunctive cells. So let's see if conjunctive cells actually deliver, are they the implementation of AND? Well, here are some typical conjunctive cells. So like those would be cells that respond to, for example, place and direction, right? So this cell here, not only it cares about this middle kind of left bit of the space, but it also only fires if the mouse is facing southeast while being in that place. Okay, so it's a combination of things. It's a combination of two values that are distinct: the location value and the direction value. But what we are not showing here is that although being a combination, it doesn't yet it doesn't necessarily has to be a dynamic computation, right? It could be just a pairwise, like a pair coding neuron that has learned it through billions and billions of presentations of a certain experience and now has dedicated itself to that combinatorial signal, right? Whereas in language of thought, we do have those things, like if you look at the predicates within language of thought, the predicate like woman has dedicated itself to the specific combination of being human and female, or boy has dedicated itself to an even longer an even more specific combination, human, male, and young. But that's not the combinatorial processing that we're really interested in, because the one that we're really interested in has to be dynamic, on the fly, and being able to combine values that are not predefined for you, right? So does that stuff exist? I've already just gone through this slide. So let me see what I think is the evidence for this. And this is, the most exciting stuff for me in this talk. So these are what's known as theta place by direction cells. And this is the work by Francesca Cacucci and colleagues. So basically in this case, where again, so the theta bit is not important for me now. So I'm just looking at the part, combinatorial part of those at the part of those cells that responds to both place and head direction. Okay, so just like in the previous examples, this is what those cells do. They respond. So this cell here, for example, actually this is a unique cell shown, but in starting with this corner, it cares about the center of this space, and it only fires when when the mouse is facing, or the rat is facing southeast. Okay. So what was added though in this experiment, which allows us to be, which leads to the excitement, is the following. So now in this experiment, they've taken that neuron and recorded it in different environments. And so the next environment in which they recorded it was the square environment. Well, the place component, we know that place cells remap, right? So when you take the place cell to a different environment, the place cell does not keep its preference. So it used to be it used to care about the center, and now it cares about, let's say that, north corner, okay? So the place signal has remapped. The head direction signal does not remap, right? The head direction cells are known to be constant in their value. So the head direction signal is still southwest. this cell as a combination of that change, that cell now means north corner, southeast, or whatever was it, like, is it southeast? Yes, southeast, whereas previously it meant center southeast. So do you see that the value of one of the conjuncts, i.e. the place, like the place value, the location value, changes dynamically with the content, with the context. And it's an equivalent of what happens when you take a two words like brown sugar, and now take brown away and replace it with purple sugar, right? So it's the combination, if there is a computation that can deliver that combination, that's equivalent, or like what I'm trying to say here is that this cells deliver an equivalent computation to a computation that's needed to get you brown sugar versus purple sugar versus orange sugar and so on. Okay. And just to show that this was, they had, this cell illustrated here, and they had a bunch of other cells that showed the similar behavior, in that the conjunctive cell was responsive to the on-the-fly contextual changes in one of the conjuncts. Of course, it's not the whole story, because ideally we'll have a cell that responds to changes in both conjuncts, and so on, because at least that's what's needed for language of thought. You don't always keep one of the conjuncts, set fixed, but that's the starting point at least. Okay, so this brings me here. So, and it brings me to the to the end of the roadmap. I have a few things that I wanted to add, which are what we're not claiming, okay? So we're claiming that spatial navigation contains the kind of ingredients that are needed for language of thought, but we're not claiming that also therefore is spatial. And, one way of showing that we're not claiming that is to kind of, bring into the picture findings from other areas, but spatial navigation. So for example, in mirror neurons and motor cognition, like the mirror neuron is basically a mirror neuron like grasping, right? That responds to the action of grasping, but not the action of, say, for example, moving something. That neuron actually can be thought of as representing the predicate grasp. It's a two-place predicate, so it adds us, the second place as well. If you want to more, that was an original argument by Gallistel. We also do not claim that all thought is hippocampal. So, we're using we're using spatial navigation as a model, and that spatial navigation system happens to be centered around the hippocampus, and hippocampus might be especially important, but it's not at all the case that those mechanisms are specifically restricted to the hippocampus. An easy way of, making that argument is to show you like a heading of the paper that finds, basically demonstrates the same mechanisms in somatosensory cortex, okay? Same types of cells, same types of computations. We're also not claiming that spatial navigation has all the needed mechanisms for language of thought. This is a proof of principle. For example, it's not clear that rats, so what's very important for the human language of thought is that you have access to those individuals. And it's not clear how you test a rat, like whether it recognizes, like anyone at the individual level, and, what's an individual for the rat, right? And actually those data maybe are more easy to get from the human side of things, right? So human hippocampal intracranial recordings, show responses, at single neuron levels to individuals. You all know Jennifer Aniston neurons or Halle Berry neurons that respond to not just the face of Halle Berry, but, to any face of Halle Berry, be it a drawing, a picture, another type of picture, to Halle Berry written in text, and so on and so forth, right? So a very abstract neuron that responds to individuals. There are lots and lots of outstanding questions. I'm not going to read them now, but, you can bring them back or you can ask. And basically, I'm ready to end, except I was going to say that if you find this stuff interesting, of course, this is an idea that requires linking across fields. If you are, interested, I will soon be moving to the University of Geneva, looking people who are, similarly minded. Drop me an email if you're looking for a PhD postdoc. I'll be very interested to hear. And the final thing is to say thank you to people who heard about those ideas when they were very, very nascent and kind of didn't think that they were completely crazy and supported us through the way.